Welcome to Unit 4, a whole school approach to the Equality Act. This unit brings everything together. It focuses on how we make sure disabled pupils are not just present, but fully included in every part of school life. It's not just about having the right policies, it's about how those policies are lived out day to day in classrooms, corridors, playgrounds, and even team meetings. Before we begin, pause and think about what inclusion looks and feels like in your school setting. If someone walked into your school, what would they notice? And who might still be left out? That's where this session starts.
Welcome to Unit 4, a whole school approach, embedding the Equality Act. Here we're looking at the bigger picture, how the Equality Act is lived out across the whole school. It's about the culture and values that shape daily life and the difference this makes for disabled pupils. When the right ethos is in place, barriers are reduced and pupils feel they belong, and that's something everyone in school plays a part in, whatever your role may be. This slide gives you a picture of what we'll explore in Unit 4. First, why a proactive approach matters. We'll think about why planning ahead makes such a difference for disabled pupils and for the whole school. Second, how to embed equality in your school's culture, policies and planning. We'll explore what it looks like when the Equality Act isn't a separate add-on but part of the way your school runs. And third, what this looks like in practice for all staff. Because while the responsible body holds the legal duty, everyone in school plays a role in creating an inclusive environment. So this unit is about stepping back and seeing the bigger picture, how schools can live the Equality Act every day through their ethos and culture, as well as through their policies and decisions. Before we go further, take a moment to reflect. Think about your day-to-day in school. Where do you already see disabled pupils being included meaningfully? Is it in lessons, clubs, trips, or pupil leadership roles? Remember, inclusion isn't only about access, it's about genuine participation and belonging. As you think about those examples, you might start to notice a pattern, that meaningful inclusion doesn't happen by chance. As we move into the next slide, we'll step back for a moment and look at the national picture to see why this proactive whole school approach really matters. Nationally, outcomes for disabled pupils remain poor, with disadvantages that begin early and often continue into adulthood. That headline is important context for this unit. Over the next few slides, we'll look at what that means in practice, the data on progress, exclusions, attendance and longer-term outcomes, and that will help us see why embedding the Equality Act across the whole school is so critical. Before we look at the evidence, I just want to be clear about the data we're drawing on. Much of the evidence we'll look at in this training comes from special educational needs or SEN data, because that's what schools are required to collect and return nationally. Schools are not asked to submit data on disability as defined by the Equality Act. Alongside this, some of the evidence we'll draw on comes from national surveys, such as those by the Office for National Statistics, which do use the broader Equality Act definition of disability. So when we look at the data on these slides, I'll make clear whether it's SEN data from schools or disability data from wider national sources. It's important to keep that distinction in mind when comparing the evidence with your own school's information. Let's start with national data on disabled people. These figures come from the Office for National Statistics, so this is disability data, not SEN data from schools. They show a consistent pattern of poorer outcomes for disabled people. The ONS reports that disabled people are less likely to have a degree, more likely to leave education with GCSEs as their highest qualification, and more likely to have no qualifications at all. That's based on data from the Family Resources Survey 2022 to 23. Now, these differences in qualification levels illustrate how disadvantage experienced in school carries forward into adulthood, shaping access to further education, employment, and wider life opportunities. The evidence on this slide comes from school-level SEN data, not disability data from national surveys. Even when pupils with SEN start at the same academic level as their classmates, they still tend to make less progress as they move through school. Research by Parsons and Platt, 2017, showed that by age 7, children identified with SEN had already fallen behind peers who began at the same starting point, and that slower progress continued right through primary school. The National Audit Office, in its 2019 report, Support for Pupils with Special Educational Needs and Disabilities in England, found the same pattern at secondary level. By Key Stage 4, pupils with SEN were still making less progress than their peers with similar starting points. So this isn't about lower starting attainment. It points to barriers within the system, and those are exactly the barriers the Equality Act requires schools to anticipate and remove. The evidence on this slide comes from school-level SEN data. Ofsted's report, Supporting SEND 2021, highlighted that children with SEND are being excluded, absent or missing from school much more frequently than other pupils nationally, and unofficial exclusions are being used. That phrase, unofficial exclusions, refers to practices such as pupils being sent home without a formal exclusion being recorded or being removed from the school roll, what's sometimes called off-rolling. Ofsted describes these patterns as critical barriers to inclusion and equal access to education. And under the Equality Act, if a disabled pupil is excluded, formally or informally, because reasonable adjustments weren't made, that is likely to amount to discrimination. This chart shows school-level SEN data from the Department for Education covering exclusion and suspension rates from 2019 to 20 to 2023 to 24. The pattern is persistent. Every year, pupils with special educational needs, both those on SEN support and those with an Education, Health and Care Plan or EHCP, are far more likely to be suspended or permanently excluded than pupils without SEN. The pandemic made this clearer. When schools closed, exclusions and suspensions dropped for all pupils, but when schools reopened, rates for pupils with SEN rose steeply. By 2023 to 24, they were higher than before the pandemic, while rates for pupils without SEN hardly shifted. The latest data show the scale of the gap. Pupils on SEN support are about 5 times more likely to be suspended or permanently excluded than their peers with no SEN. Pupils with an EHCP are about 3 times more likely. And here's the striking point. Even with the statutory protections and support planning that comes with an EHCP, those pupils are still 3 times more likely to be excluded. For pupils on SEN support who don't have that legal framework, the risk is even greater. Research shows that pupils with social, emotional and mental health needs are especially overrepresented in these figures. So what do we take from this? This pattern shows why the Equality Act duties are so important. Schools have a duty to anticipate and remove barriers, to make reasonable adjustments and to have due regard to reducing these inequalities. This slide shows how, in addition to exclusions and suspensions, pupils with special educational needs and disabilities often miss out on education in other ways. The evidence here draws on both school-level SEN data and disability data, depending on the source. Research from the UCL Institute of Education, the SENSE study led by Rob Webster in 2017, uses school-level SEN data. It found that pupils with an Education, Health and Care Plan, or EHCP, spent a much larger share of lesson time with teaching assistants than with qualified teachers. That meant less direct teaching and fewer opportunities to learn alongside classmates. Ofsted's Supporting SEND report in 2021, using mainly SEN data, also highlighted that disabled pupils are more likely to miss out on wider parts of school life, such as trips, after-school clubs and leadership opportunities like being part of school council. And the Children's Commissioner's report in 2014, titled "It Might Be Best If You Looked Elsewhere," uses disability data based on the Equality Act definition. It documented how some families were actively or subtly discouraged from admissions. Parents reported being told things like, "It might be best if he didn't come here," or "She wouldn't be offered a place because we can't meet her needs." These examples remind us that exclusion isn't only about official suspensions or permanent exclusions. It can also happen through day-to-day decisions that reduce access to teaching, to enrichment, or even to a school place. Under the Equality Act, those patterns can amount to discrimination, where disabled pupils are denied equal access or treated less favourably. All of the evidence we've just looked at, slower progress, higher rates of exclusion and absence, and the way pupils with special educational needs and disabilities miss out on wider school life, contributes to poorer educational outcomes overall. And those poorer educational outcomes don't just stop when pupils leave school. They carry forward into adult life. Research from the Office for National Statistics, published by Fubert in 2021, uses disability data and shows that disabled adults are less likely to be in employment, less likely to own their own home, and report lower well-being. At the same time, they are more likely to experience higher levels of anxiety, loneliness, and domestic abuse. The report concluded that there is a need for better support for disabled students in education to enable higher achievement and progression. In other words, what happens in school has a lasting impact, and better support during school years is essential if disabled pupils are to have equal life chances. So we've seen how poorer educational outcomes for disabled pupils link to poorer life outcomes. This slide highlights another barrier that contributes to those outcomes: the low expectations and lack of ambition that too often shape disabled pupils' experiences. Ofsted's 2021 report, SEND, Old Issues, New Issues, Next Steps, found that despite some improvements since the SEND reforms, long-standing issues remain widespread. Among these are inconsistent provision, insufficient support, and crucially, low expectations for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. The House of Lords Public Services Committee came to the same conclusion in 2024. Their inquiry into the transition from education to work reported that low expectations often begin very early. In one example, staff in a nursery setting asked children what they wanted to be when they grew up. They listened to each child, including one boy who said he wanted to be a bus. But as the committee recorded, they skipped over the little girl with Down syndrome. They did not ask her. The report warned that this kind of low expectation continues right through education, influencing the advice, opportunities, and ambition disabled young people are given. So this isn't only about resources or provision, it's also about culture and attitudes. The Equality Act requires schools to remove barriers and provide equal access, and that includes ensuring disabled pupils are seen, heard, and supported to dream big and aim high. Everything we've seen so far shows the disadvantage disabled pupils can face, so the question is this: how do we build the confidence to change this? The evidence on this slide highlights what staff are telling us. In 2023, TeacherTapp found that 55% of teachers want more high-quality CPD opportunities focused on special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND. The Education Endowment Foundation reminds us that high-quality teaching is the most effective way to support pupils with SEND. Pearson's 2023 school report found that 63% of teachers saw support for children with SEND as a barrier to pupil learning. 24. CFE research reported that 76% of teaching assistants want more SEND-specific training. Taken together, this tells us that many staff don't feel they've had the preparation they need, and that building knowledge and confidence is still the top priority. And that matters because the Equality Act is a whole school thing. It isn't just about policies or senior leaders. It's about every member of staff knowing how to anticipate barriers, make reasonable adjustments, and ensure disabled pupils can take part in everything the school offers. So a whole school duty really does need a whole school confidence. And that confidence comes through high quality training, support, and leadership that prioritises inclusion. What's one thing that would help you feel more confident in supporting disabled pupils in your role? Jot it down or keep it in mind. It could be something that you want to raise with your line manager or bring to a staff meeting or a CPD discussion. Creating a school where everyone belongs is at the heart of meeting our Equality Act duties. Belonging means pupils feel welcomed, valued, and a full part of school life. And when that happens, schools find it much easier to anticipate barriers and make those reasonable adjustments. That sense of belonging starts with the welcome we give to pupils and families. When disabled pupils and their families know right from the outset that their place in school is assured and valued, it sets the expectation that they will be fully included in all aspects of school life. That might look like a warm introduction meeting, clear information about adjustments, or simply a "we're glad you're here" message can all send a strong signal that they belong. Celebrating difference helps embed equality into the culture of the school. It shows diversity as a strength through curriculum choices, assemblies, displays, and the everyday language we use. And this supports the duty to foster good relations and helps reduce the risk of bullying or exclusion. Building relationships with pupils and families and ensuring their voices are heard is central to anticipating barriers and planning reasonable adjustments. But the Children's Commissioner's 2025 school census found many families still doubt feedback leads to change. Following up, for example, showing how concerns about school trips or playground access have been addressed, builds trust and shows their input matters. Being ambitious is also vital. Ofsted has highlighted that low expectations remain a national barrier. The Equality Act requires schools to anticipate adjustments and, where needed, treat disabled pupils more favourably so they can take part fully. Staff training underpins all of this. Every member of staff, from teachers to lunchtime supervisors, has a role in recognising barriers and acting on them. Training and confidence building make those duties practical in everyday situations, and reviewing arrangements regularly is part of that anticipatory duty. What worked last year may not work now, so schools must keep checking and adapting to make sure barriers continue to be removed. Taken together, these practices help schools to meet all of the individual and strategic duties in the Equality Act, and in doing so, they create a school where every pupil belongs. Why does this matter to all of us? Well, embedding the Equality Act isn't the job of one person. It's a whole school responsibility. Everyone has a role to play in avoiding discrimination, anticipating and making reasonable adjustments, and ensuring disabled pupils are treated fairly. When schools embed the Act, it helps create a welcoming and inclusive environment where all pupils can participate fully, and that includes everyday school life. Classrooms, corridors, trips, clubs and assemblies, not just lessons. It also prevents unfair treatment. For example, blanket policies that seem neutral can easily disadvantage disabled pupils, like applying behaviour sanctions without considering how a pupil's disability may affect their actions. Embedding the Equality Act means thinking ahead so that policies and practices are fair to everyone. Understanding the Act matters for your work with pupils, but the duties go wider too. The responsible body has legal obligations to disabled staff, parents, carers and visitors. So why does this matter to all of us? Well, because every decision in the classroom, the playground, the school office, or in decisions made by the responsible body either removes barriers or creates them. The Equality Act gives us the framework, but it takes everyone in school working together to bring it to life. The responsible body for the school, whether that's the governing board, the academy trust, proprietor or the local authority, has responsibility for the duties in the Equality Act. This means it has responsibility for ensuring that the school complies with the legislation and is ultimately the entity that can be held liable if the school fails to meet its obligations under the Act. The responsible body also has responsibility for the actions of its employees while working for the school and for others, called agents, working on its behalf. It must take reasonable steps to make sure that employees and agents understand the duties and act in light of this understanding. Although the duties themselves cannot be delegated, meeting those duties is realised through everyday decisions and interactions across the school. The next slide looks at how roles across the school contribute to putting the Equality Act into practice. All staff, teaching, support, non-teaching, must understand and act within the Equality Act. Whether you're a class teacher, a teaching assistant, or working in the office, your actions are part of how the school meets its legal duties. Acting within the Equality Act duties means actively avoiding discrimination and other prohibited conduct and anticipating and making reasonable adjustments for disabled pupils. For teachers, this is reinforced in the teachers' standards. From the very start of their career, teachers are expected to understand the statutory frameworks that set out their professional duties, including the Equality Act, and to act within them. That means promoting equal opportunities, making reasonable adjustments, and adapting teaching responsively without lowering expectations, so that all pupils have the chance to succeed. It plays out in the everyday choices we make, such as how a lesson's organised or how a trip is planned, or even how a lunchtime routine is run. And it's important to say that your daily observations really do matter. Your daily work, your planning, and even your informal conversations with pupils and families can help identify barriers and solutions. For example, a parent may tell an office colleague about a reasonable adjustment their child needs. That insight is just as valuable as what a teacher sees in the classroom. Sharing what you notice helps the school remove those barriers and improve accessibility. This last point, taking the lead in your area, is about shared responsibility. A whole school approach means everyone takes the lead for accessibility in their own area of work. For staff with curriculum responsibilities, this means making sure disabled pupils can access the curriculum in your subject. That might include planning for resources, teaching methods, or approaches that increase access to different parts of the curriculum. For those leading before or after school activities, it means ensuring clubs and opportunities beyond the classroom are accessible. Every pupil should be able to join in and benefit from those wider experiences. Administrative staff and those working in the school office are often the first point of contact for families and pupils. The information they hear and share can helpfully inform both daily operations and the school's strategic accessibility plans. Those serving meals, supervising lunch times, or maintaining the building also have a really important role. Maintenance staff, for example, directly contribute to the physical environment, whether that's through acoustics, ramps, doorways, or quiet areas, and those adjustments can make a big difference for disabled pupils. So taking the lead doesn't always mean something big or formal. It's about noticing where you have influence and embedding accessibility and inclusion in your own area every single day. And where schools adopt a whole school approach, they'll find it much easier to improve equality of opportunity for disabled pupils. Ofsted's role is to assess the extent to which schools are meeting their statutory duties under the Equality Act. That means they consider how well the responsible body, whether that's the governing board, the academy trust, the proprietor, or the local authority, ensures that duties are fulfilled in practice. Inspectors look for a clear and ambitious vision for high-quality inclusive education. They expect schools to show that their curriculum is broad, ambitious, and designed to include disabled pupils from the outset. Importantly, Ofsted does not expect schools to reduce the curriculum for disabled pupils. Instead, they look for evidence of proactive planning and adjustments that allow all pupils to take part meaningfully. Accessibility plans, reasonable adjustments, and inclusive practices all serve as really important evidence. Now, this doesn't mean creating new work just for inspection. It's about using the plans, objectives, and day-to-day practices you already have. When schools adopt a whole school approach, embedding equality into ethos, teaching, and decision-making, they not only meet their legal duties, but also create the kind of environment Ofsted values, one where all pupils can thrive together and difference is seen as a strength. Moving from compliance to culture, the Equality Act tells us about accountability and duties, but to embed it fully, we need more than systems. We need culture. Margaret Mead's reminder on this slide is that change is always driven by committed individuals. Think about the small actions: a teacher adapting a lesson, a teaching assistant making sure a child is included at playtime, an office member listening carefully to a parent, a lunchtime supervisor noticing who's been left out. It's the everyday actions of staff that build a school's culture. When we talk about values, it's important to remember that the vision and ethos of the school shapes how equality and inclusion are experienced every single day. Shared values aren't just words on a website. They're the guiding principles that show up in the way staff interact with pupils, the way rules are applied, and the way that school life is organised. For example, embracing an inclusive ethos might mean ensuring assemblies showcase a diverse range of achievements, including disabled pupils' contributions. Modelling inclusive behaviours can be as simple as lunchtime staff making sure that disabled pupils are fully included in playground games, or office staff welcoming families with warmth and respect. Teaching values happens not only in PSHE lessons, but also in how teachers handle incidents of unkindness or derogatory language, and fostering belonging might mean ensuring that pupils with medical conditions can take part in school trips through careful planning, or that leadership roles like school council are accessible to all pupils. And of course, the best way to know what really fosters belonging is to ask pupils themselves. Listening to disabled pupils regularly, meaningfully, and in ways that work for them is essential if we're serious about turning our values into lived reality. An important part of moving from compliance to culture is making sure disabled pupils are genuinely listened to and involved in shaping their school experience. Now, many of you are already doing excellent work on pupil voice through school councils, class discussions, surveys, and numerous pupil-led initiatives. What the Equality Act asks of us is to make sure that those opportunities really include all disabled pupils, and that their voices aren't just symbolic, but genuinely shape what happens. That means creating regular, structured opportunities for disabled pupils to be heard, rather than leaving it to chance. For some schools, that might look like inclusion ambassadors or pupil forums. For others, it's built into mentoring, EHCP reviews, or daily check-ins. It also means thinking about a range of accessible communication methods. Not every pupil, as we know, communicates in the same way, and here's where your expertise really comes in. Some pupils use speech, some communicate through signing, symbols, assistive technology, or behaviour. Every method is valid, and schools already have creative approaches to capturing those voices. Trusted relationships are vital too. Pupils are much more likely to share honestly with adults they feel safe with. Sometimes that may be a teaching assistant, or sometimes it may be a teacher. Schools are already skilled at spotting and nurturing those relationships. And when we ask pupils what helps or hinders them, the answers can be quite powerful. Often it's simple, practical things that make a huge difference. Many of you will have examples where small adjustments suggested by pupils themselves have transformed participation. Finally, it's about making involvement meaningful, not just symbolic. So not just a disabled pupil on a school council as a tick box, but ensuring their views actively influence decisions, whether that's about trips, playground spaces, or teaching strategies. One practical example comes from a secondary school that set up inclusion ambassadors. Disabled pupils worked alongside staff to review lunchtime arrangements and suggested changes that made the environment calmer and more inclusive. Staff reported that those insights were things they might not necessarily have spotted themselves. The message here is clear. Disabled pupils must be involved in shaping school life, not as an add-on, but as part of the culture of how the school listens to all pupils. We've talked about listening to pupils' voices, but it isn't only pupils' voices that matter. Families also bring vital insights, and schools are at their best when they work with parents, carers, and wider services, rather than in isolation. So what does that look like in practice? Here are some of the key ways schools can build strong, effective partnerships that make inclusion real. First, value family insights. Families know their children best. Parents and carers often understand what helps and what hinders their child's learning and participation. When schools take time to listen and act on those perspectives, barriers can often be spotted and removed much more effectively. Second, co-produce and partner. Good practice isn't about schools doing things to families, but with them. Co-production means involving parents and carers in shaping solutions, whether that's reviewing policies, planning trips, or designing individual adjustments. It builds trust and makes sure decisions actually meet real needs. Third, share information and offer support. Families need clear, accessible information about what's available, how decisions are made, and how they can be involved. Under the Children and Families Act, local authorities must provide SENDIAS services, and schools have a role in signposting families to those services and cooperating with the local authority to make that support work. Next, engage external expertise. Schools don't have to do this alone. Health professionals, therapists, and advisory teachers can all offer insights that shape reasonable adjustments and inform accessibility plans. Calling on that expertise is part of meeting the anticipatory duty. And finally, feedback and review. Inclusion is very rarely perfect first time. Seeking feedback, learning from it, and adjusting practice shows commitment to continuous improvement and helps strengthen those relationships with families. Let's take the example on the slide. Here, the school invited feedback from a parent who had highlighted barriers in how a trip was organised. By acting on that feedback, the school was able to anticipate disadvantage, make the necessary adjustments, and ensure the pupil joined their peers. That's a really simple but powerful illustration of what the anticipatory duty looks like in practice. Working with families helps us get things right in the moment, but it also shapes the bigger picture. When we listen, act, and plan together, we not only remove barriers now, we also raise pupils' confidence and open up future pathways. Earlier in this unit, we looked at national data showing that disabled children and young people often experience poorer outcomes, especially around exclusions, attainment, and what happens after they leave school. One reason for those outcomes is low expectations, both within the system and sometimes in the messages children pick up from the adults around them. This slide focuses on the role schools can play in actively raising aspirations and opening up future pathways. It's about how your school's ethos and everyday practice can shape ambition, and how by building this into your culture, you can help change the patterns that national data has highlighted. Early conversations shape future ambition. The Office for National Statistics data we looked at earlier showed that disabled young people are less likely to be in education, employment, or training after school. The roots of that can be traced back to early expectations. So the conversations we have in early years and primary school shape whether pupils even see themselves in that data differently, whether they believe they can have a different story. For example, a school that consistently asks disabled pupils what they'd like to try on sports day communicates from the earliest years that they are expected to take part and to succeed, and those messages build confidence and shape future ambition. Raising aspirations must start from the very beginning. This isn't something to leave until GCSE choices or careers planning. It begins in the early years with the vision and ethos set by leaders, and it continues right through to adulthood. The responsible body, whether that's the governing body, academy trust, proprietor, or local authority, sets the tone for ambition across the life of the school. And of course, that ambition applies not only to academic learning, but to participation, achievement, and wider opportunities. When ambition is missing at any stage, it can quietly close off pathways before they're even explored. For example, an accessibility plan that includes adjustments for after-school clubs signals to pupils and parents that inclusion in this school extends beyond lessons. It's part of the school's ethos from day one. Careers guidance plays a big part too. National data also shows that pupils with special educational needs are less likely to stay in education, training or employment after leaving school or college. That's why careers guidance has to be both inclusive and aspirational, to challenge stereotypes and open up real options. One simple but powerful approach may involve inviting disabled role models to speak during a careers week. That directly challenges stereotypes and helps pupils picture themselves in future roles. Schools are also expected to follow the Gatsby benchmarks, a framework of 8 standards for high-quality careers education in England. Disabled pupils must be fully included, meeting employers, visiting workplaces, and taking part in mentoring, all made accessible through thoughtful planning around transport, communication, and support. And ideally, this should start early, even in primary. The government's SEND Code of Practice reminds us that supporting independence and employability can be life-changing, but only if it starts early and builds on pupils' own interests and ambitions. Another example might be a coding club, using adapted keyboards or screen readers so every pupil can take part. That one experience could spark a lasting interest that shapes future study choices and career goals. Ask yourself, does every child and young person in your school see a future that includes them? What messages are disabled pupils hearing from staff, in lessons, in corridors, or in assemblies, about what their future could look like? Why these questions? Well, because those everyday messages shape confidence, ambition, and life chances long after school ends. Our values and ethos show what we stand for, but it's in our policies and practices that those values are really tested. This is where the Equality Act places a proactive duty on schools to plan ahead, make reasonable adjustments, and make sure that no pupil is disadvantaged by the way our rules and routines are set. All policies and practices must comply with the Act. That means behaviour policies, uniform policies, enrichment policies, admissions arrangements. Every policy must comply. The legal duty to make reasonable adjustments is an anticipatory duty, meaning schools must think ahead when they're planning their policies and must plan and make reasonable adjustments to these policies for disabled pupils. Policies must not discriminate. Blanket approaches, such as a rule that all pupils must complete homework online without recognising pupils who need assistive technology or paper copies, can amount to indirect discrimination. Reviewing policies, and proactively, means not waiting until something goes wrong. Policies should be checked regularly to ensure they don't disadvantage disabled pupils. But practices matter just as much. A school could say, we've always expected every pupil to line up silently before lunch. But for some autistic pupils, this practice creates unnecessary distress. Reviewing practices means asking, does this routine put disabled pupils at a disadvantage? If so, the Equality Act requires a reasonable adjustment, such as allowing that pupil to wait at the front or enter separately. Reviewing practices proactively means asking, is this activity accessible to all pupils? And if not, what adjustments do we need to plan? Remember, the definition of disability is broad. Schools need to hold this broad definition in mind when reviewing both policies and daily practices. Treating everyone identically isn't always fair if it leaves some pupils at a disadvantage. And that's why the Act makes clear it's not discrimination to treat a disabled pupil more favourably to address disadvantage. In fact, that's sometimes exactly what equality requires. These questions on the slide are designed to help you look at familiar areas of school life, behaviour, uniform, and communication with parents, and think about them through the lens of the Equality Act. They prompt us to ask, could the way we usually do things unintentionally disadvantage disabled pupils, and where might reasonable adjustments be needed? Here are 3 questions. In the classroom, am I following the behaviour policy in a way that considers whether a pupil might need reasonable adjustments because of a disability? Regarding uniform, could the uniform policy unintentionally disadvantage a pupil because of their disability? For example, sensory issues or medical needs. Communicating with parents. Am I making sure that the information we send home or share is accessible to all parents, including those with disabilities? Do we offer information in different formats if needed? Pause the video here, choose one of these questions, jot down your reflections, and think about how it applies to your role. Once you've done that, restart the video and we'll move on to think about what different treatment looks like under the Equality Act. You can apply these sorts of questions to policies and practices across all areas of school life. If you see a policy creating a barrier for a student, don't feel afraid to speak up. Share your observations with the SENCO or a school leader. This slide is about holding 2 things together in our minds at the same time. First, the legal basis for different treatment. The Equality Act requires schools to make reasonable adjustments. If a school fails to make reasonable adjustments, that in itself is a form of discrimination. Sometimes fulfilling this duty requires treating disabled pupils more favourably than their peers. This is what the law provides for. Equality does not always mean identical treatment, but here's the challenge. Adjustments must be made in ways that uphold dignity and promote inclusion. If adjustments are not implemented thoughtfully, pupils can end up feeling set apart or stigmatised, and peers may perceive them as being treated unfairly. That's why the question on this slide is so important. When does treating pupils differently, as the law requires, promote inclusion? And when might the way it's done risk making them feel different or excluded? On the next slide, we'll hear directly from pupils themselves about how this balance plays out in practice. This slide shares what pupils themselves say about their experiences of different treatment in school. Their words are a really powerful reminder that how we make reasonable adjustments matters just as much as the adjustment itself. Sometimes, even well-intentioned support can leave pupils feeling singled out, different, or less capable. For example, when help is offered in a way that draws attention, or when a pupil feels protected rather than included. The Office for National Statistics study in 2022 highlighted this clearly. One pupil described feeling that their school assumed that they always needed an adult, which made their classmates see them as less independent. But pupils also describe when things go well, when teachers understand their needs, explain things sensitively, and create a classroom where difference is accepted. Pupils can embrace the adjustments and feel proud of how they learn. I'll give you a moment to pause the video and read through these quotes on the screen. And as you do that, think about this question. What do they tell us about how adjustments should be put in place if we want to support dignity and belonging rather than stigma? The key message here is this. The Equality Act requires us to make reasonable adjustments, but pupils remind us that how we deliver those adjustments is absolutely crucial. Effective reasonable adjustments foster dignity and inclusion. On the last 2 slides, we explored why avoiding stigma and promoting understanding really matters. The law requires different treatment, and pupils have told us how that can sometimes feel, both positively and negatively, depending on how it's done. This slide is about how schools can put that duty into practice in ways that avoid stigma and promote understanding. So what can schools do? First, it's important to remember that the definition of disability is broad. If schools hold too narrow a view, they risk overlooking pupils who are entitled to reasonable adjustments. Schools can involve disabled pupils themselves in planning reasonable adjustments. Ask what helps, what doesn't, and how changes can be introduced in a way that feels respectful. It's often the simplest and most effective way to avoid stigma. Be mindful of confidentiality. Information about a pupil's disability should only be shared on a need-to-know basis, and that way we protect privacy and dignity. Schools can promote an environment where difference is normalised and celebrated. For example, instead of only offering large print worksheets to one pupil, consider offering that option to everyone. Or highlight a pupil's use of assistive technology as a great tool for learning, rather than something that sets them apart. And finally, remember this key principle: treating everyone the same, regardless of disability, can itself result in discrimination. That's one of the most powerful lessons of the Equality Act. Equality isn't about identical treatment. It's about recognising and removing barriers so every pupil can take part, feel they belong, and thrive alongside their peers. You'll notice we've come back to many of these points throughout this unit, and that's deliberate. They're the foundations that run through every part of the Equality Act and every part of good school practice. So, building on what we've just covered around avoiding stigma and promoting understanding, we're going to look at what this means in everyday practice. Embedding reasonable adjustments right across the school helps to create that culture where pupils don't feel different for needing them, and that's because flexibility and accessibility simply become part of how we do things in this school. Every member of staff has a professional responsibility to anticipate and contribute to reasonable adjustments within their role. And the good news is, these are often things you're already doing every day, whether you're adapting your language, thinking ahead about seating, or noticing when a pupil's struggling with noise or routines. Those are all examples of reasonable adjustments in practice. What the Equality Act does is bring those everyday decisions into focus, so they're consistent and proactive across the whole school. Teaching assistants play a key part in this. They help pupils access learning by removing day-to-day barriers. They support the use of auxiliary aids and services, so things like visual timetables or sensory tools. And because they're often closest to classroom routines, they can offer feedback on what's working or what isn't, so that adjustments can be refined over time. Supervisors, including lunchtime and break time staff, have just as important a role. They make adjustments during unstructured times, making sure every pupil is included in games or routines. They notice and remove barriers to participation, for example, managing noise levels, helping with tricky transitions, or supporting social interaction in the playground or corridors. And they use agreed strategies such as offering a quiet space or using cue cards to reduce disadvantage and support access for all pupils. Teachers also make a major difference day to day. They use a range of different teaching methods so that pupils can access learning in varied ways, avoiding situations where some are disadvantaged. They make anticipatory adjustments, planning seating in advance, allowing extra time when needed, or preparing alternative versions of resources before problems arise. They provide accessible materials, such as large print, coloured overlays or visual reminders, and they think ahead to reduce unfair impact, even when a pupil doesn't yet have a diagnosis or formal plan. Together, these are the kinds of actions that make equality real, and they show that inclusion isn't a specialist task or an add-on. It's part of how we work, all of us, every day, to make our school fairer for everyone. I'm very aware that we've only highlighted a few examples here, but of course there are many other professionals across the school community who play an equally important role. The same principle applies to everyone. When every adult takes responsibility in their own role, inclusion becomes something the school is, not just something the school does. So far, we've looked at what reasonable adjustments look like in everyday practice, across teaching, support, and wider school life. But of course, these duties don't sit in isolation. They connect closely with the wider legal framework that schools already work within. In Unit 3, we looked at how the Equality Act sits alongside the Children and Families Act and how the two frameworks work together. This slide brings that connection back into focus. So, alongside the Equality Act, schools also have responsibilities under the Children and Families Act 2014, often referred to as the CFA. These duties are just as important for shaping a school's culture and ethos, because they ensure that disabled pupils, those with SEN, special educational needs, and those with medical conditions are all fully included in the life of the school, and that the same high aspirations are held for every child. It's important to remember that the definition of disability used in the SEN framework of the CFA is the same as the definition used in the Equality Act. That means the same pupil may be covered by both frameworks. Schools need to understand this overlap so that they can meet their duties to disabled pupils, pupils with SEN, and pupils with medical conditions in a joined-up way. Equally, not every pupil with a medical condition will have SEN, but many will still meet the Equality Act's definition of disability. Schools must make arrangements to support them, and in doing so, must have regard to the statutory guidance. The CFA sets out several key requirements that are directly relevant to schools' duties towards all three groups of pupils. First, the best endeavours duty. Maintained mainstream schools, academies, maintained nursery schools, alternative provision academies and PRUs must use their best endeavours to secure the special educational provision that a pupil's SEN calls for. This is a direct and specific duty under the CFA. Second, having regard to the SEND Code of Practice. This duty applies to a wide range of schools, including non-maintained and certain independent special schools. They must have regard to the code when exercising their SEN and disability functions under the CFA. Schools can't simply ignore it. They need to be able to demonstrate that their actions reflect what the code says about fulfilling their statutory duties. Third, engagement in school activities. Mainstream state schools and maintained nursery schools must ensure that children with SEN can take part in the activities of the school alongside children who do not have SEN, except in very limited circumstances. And for many pupils, this is where the Equality Act duties come into play, because it's through those reasonable adjustments that this engagement becomes possible. Fourth, the SEN Information Report. The CFA requires maintained schools, academies and maintained nursery schools to publish an SEN Information Report. This must include information about arrangements that directly overlap with Equality Act duties, such as how the school admits disabled pupils, the steps taken to prevent less favourable treatment, the facilities provided to assist access, and information as to the school's accessibility plan. So this isn't just about SEN. It also covers how schools plan for disabled pupils and those with medical conditions to make sure all pupils can participate fully in school life. Fifth, support for pupils with medical conditions. Section 100 of the CFA places a duty on maintained schools, academies and PRUs to make arrangements to support pupils with medical conditions. Many of these pupils will also meet the Equality Act's definition of disability. Schools must have regard to the statutory guidance when meeting this duty, and that includes anticipating and removing barriers so pupils can take part in learning and school life. Finally, cooperation with local authority duties. The CFA places a range of duties on local authorities. For example, to identify disabled children, keep provision under review, and publish a local offer. Schools are under a legal duty to cooperate with their local authority in fulfilling these responsibilities. That cooperation includes helping to identify disabled pupils, ensuring families know about available support, and working together to secure the best possible outcomes. So when we talk about culture and ethos, it's not just the Equality Act that matters. The Children and Families Act reinforces the same principle that schools should be ambitious for every child, remove barriers in daily life and plan proactively for inclusion. Together, these two acts provide a complete legal framework that supports the school's ethos of fairness, participation and high aspiration for all. But what happens when things go wrong? When a school's actions or inaction amount to discrimination under the Equality Act? We looked at this briefly in Unit 2, but it's worth returning to remind ourselves what happens when a claim of disability discrimination is made against a school. Who can bring a claim? A parent can make a claim to the first tier tribunal. That's the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal, often called the SEND Tribunal. Young people themselves can also make a claim on their own behalf once they're over school leaving age. Time limits. There are strict time limits for making a claim. Usually, a claim must be made within 6 months of the alleged discrimination. If the discrimination is part of a series of incidents, the 6 months runs from the date of the last incident. However, the tribunal does have discretion to extend this period if it believes it's just and equitable, in other words, fair and reasonable to do so. When a case of disability discrimination is upheld, the tribunal has specific powers to put things right. The tribunal can order the school to take steps to remove or reduce the adverse effect experienced by the pupil. That could include changing a policy or practice, providing staff training, issuing an apology, or making sure a pupil has access to opportunities they previously missed. However, the tribunal cannot order financial compensation. Now, these powers apply in cases involving both fixed period exclusions, suspensions, and permanent exclusions. If parents believe disability discrimination occurred, they can make a claim to the SEN tribunal. This can run in parallel with the exclusion review processes. For a permanent exclusion, that can include the Independent Review Panel, IRP. The review routes consider the exclusion decision. The tribunal looks specifically at disability discrimination under the Equality Act. And remember, failure to make reasonable adjustments to policies, like a behaviour policy, which results in disadvantage or exclusion for a disabled pupil, is very likely to amount to discrimination. We've covered a huge amount in Unit 4, so let's bring our main takeaway points together. Everyone in school has a role in meeting Equality Act duties. The responsible body is accountable, but staff at every level act on its behalf. This means everyone contributes to ensuring disabled pupils are not discriminated against. Schools must remove barriers to participation and inclusion, and this is at the heart of avoiding discrimination. The duty is anticipatory. Schools must think ahead, identify where barriers may arise, and plan reasonable adjustments proactively so that disabled pupils are not placed at a substantial disadvantage compared with their peers. This applies across the whole life of the school and on an ongoing basis. Policies must be reviewed to avoid discrimination. A one-size-fits-all approach can create barriers if policies don't allow for flexibility or reasonable adjustments. For example, blanket rules on behaviour, uniform or trip participation may inadvertently disadvantage disabled pupils unless they're carefully reviewed. Disabled pupils must be able to participate in all aspects of school life, not just the taught curriculum. Inclusion has to extend to sport, creative opportunities, leadership roles, social activities, and everything else that makes up a child's school experience. Planning with disabled pupils and families improves practice in school. Involving them means schools can better anticipate barriers and put in place adjustments that actually work. Ofsted's Education Inspection Framework and its equality statement emphasise that schools should promote equality of opportunity so that all pupils can thrive together, understanding that difference is a positive, not a negative, and that individual characteristics make people unique. These principles are most powerful when they're part of our daily practice. This is an opportunity to think about how you might bring them into the routines and responsibilities of your own role. That being said, let's finish by thinking about what this means for you back in school. You spent time exploring how the Equality Act sits within everyday practice. Now it's about applying that learning. I'd like you in a moment to pause the video and choose one step you could take. It doesn't need to be something huge. Often it's the really small things that make the biggest difference. It might be asking a pupil what helps them feel included. Sometimes we talk to pupils about how their weekend was or how their learning's going, but we don't always ask what helps them feel part of things. That conversation might give you a new insight. It might be reviewing a routine or resource for accessibility. It could be something as everyday as how pupils line up, how they move between classes, or the way lunch times are organised. It might also be the visual timetables or communication tools you use. Are they helping everyone access what's happening? It might be sharing something you've learned today with a colleague. That's about building shared understanding and shared values, so you're not carrying this work alone. It might also be bringing an inclusive lens to your next team meeting. So for example, when curriculum, trips or activities are being discussed, asking, how will this work for disabled pupils? What reasonable adjustments do we need to put in place ahead of time? Once you've chosen your step, tell someone about it, whether that's a colleague, a line manager, or even a pupil. We know we're much more likely to follow through when we said it out loud. Okay, pick one action you'll take forward and make a note of who you'll share it with. You can use one of the examples mentioned or come up with your own. Pause the video now and press play when you're ready to continue. Welcome back! I hope you've had a chance to note down your one action and perhaps even got as far as thinking about who you'll share it with. Those small steps taken by many people across the school are what creates culture change. Thank you for the time you've invested with us today.
You've reached the end of this unit. Thank you for taking the time. Understanding these duties under the Equality Act is an important step in making sure disabled pupils are not at a disadvantage in school. So before you move on, take a few minutes to complete the takeaway activity. It's there to help you think through what this means in your role and what might need to change in the way that things are done. When schools get this right for disabled pupils, it often leads to stronger, more inclusive practice for everyone. Thank you once again. Goodbye.
The Council for Disabled Children has produced a family of Equality Act guides that underpin this training. They're grounded in legislation and statutory guidance and provide explanations, examples and practical tools for schools and settings. The Teacher's Guide focuses on what school staff need to know and do in day-to-day practice. The Guide for Governors and Trustees sets out the strategic responsibilities of the governing body or academy trust, whoever the responsible body is under the Act, and includes helpful checkpoints for review and accountability.